right, welcome back. We're going to do another podcast episode. I realize it's been a while since I've uploaded anything, so the reason for that is one, there's a lot of thoughts that have been, funneling through my mind. Of course, that's not unusual, but just more focally and in terms of where I really wanted to go after the last upload. And then secondly, just taking a little bit of time and a break to maybe rest, feel out my body, get back to kind of the normalcy and feel somewhat normal. We also did take the opportunity with that time to kind of move around the studio. As you'll see, the desk is in a new spot and the background is where it used to be. So it's not even really that big of a deal as far as upgrade in the studio. However, it's kind of nice. Like, I've always been an individual when I was younger, for example, where I always liked moving things around. Just it gives you a different feel, even at a different point of resting your head in the room. I used to change around my bedroom once a month at a certain point. I don't know if there was a single new position I could have put my bed after so many times moving things around, but it's just kind of something that I think allows the creative juices to flow a little bit differently and ultimately feel ourselves into a new paradigm, if you will. Nonetheless, as we're reaching this subject, what I'll be talking about is ultimately from the past channel. So I had ultimately worked on a fairly large project which culminated in a lot of feedback, also gave me a lot of recognition of kind of the power of what is manifestation. Now, manifestation is kind of a complex word. It's something that can be taken in a lot of different facets internally, digested. In my experience, what I'm talking about specifically is one, as a songwriter, two, as like a poet, three, as just a journaling individual, where if and when I have been able and given myself the opportunity to basically present new ideas to myself and in one frame of mind and at one point in life, one moment in time. It's interesting to me how I've been able to, no matter what it was or how it was or where it was, when it was, I could always go back in due time, say a couple years later, and look back and see how that manifested itself into the world. And it becomes a really empowering type of practice. So it says to say, I remember writing one of my first songs ever on paper and playing it for my family. It's a song called As If, and it was how I felt as like a high school kid, for example, who felt a certain way about the religious and church-oriented family that we were versus how I was perceiving the world and who and what I could do. And it was as if to tell myself these types of things as if they could happen. And so in due time, after high school, I'd go back and reread and replay these things on open mic night, for example, was when it came out, and I had realized, like, no, this is something that really got my engine going. This is something that put me in a new position. Another point in my life was I did a landmark forum in the end of 2012, shortly before I decided the one thing I wanted in my life to create some new possibilities was to stop drinking. So I created the reality or the possibility at the end of my landmark forum that if I were to avoid alcohol in my life, that would then ensue or subsequently eliminate some of the distractions with my relationships that were destructive, that weren't really building me up, that allowed me, or rather didn't allow me to be who I really felt I could be as my authentic self. Now, that's a huge position that I push and I talk about a lot in this, because that is the ultimate culmination of my purpose is to find who this authentic self is. I'm wearing orange today, more in observation of like the creative capacity. Orange is also, if you look at it from a chakra standpoint, it's the sexual organs, but representation of creativity. So creativity is the baseline of development into who we ultimately become. I've been talking with friends in recent weeks here since my last upload too, in particular about creativity and what that means and where that development actually exists in our body. So there's a thing called the 7-year cycle, for example. And the 7-year cycle is as a newborn until about 7 years old, and this is just it's organized as though you're expected to be able to move through each phase of these within an annual cycle. It's not always exact to that, but ultimately my belief is that with the balances of the outer world and the planetary systems that kind of also create this organic balance between where we are and where they are, we incoherently or unintentionally find ourselves at those phases of development. So the first is like our root chakra, where we're based in earth. We're really getting our first fundamental understanding. The traumas and the loves that we receive, they tend to stick with us in our root chakra. That's at the base of our spine, sorry. And then the second chakra is the second year of life, where we're ultimately moving more into our creative capacity in expression. A 2-year-old, the mine. This is mine, that's mine, mine. It's taking ownership of certain things. So as a 3-year-old, then you move, of course, into like, it's a fire sign, it's a personal power, it's boundaries and different orientation with the world around us, but from a point and place of power within our diaphragm and stomach areas. And then ultimately we get to the balanced center, which is our heart at about 4 years to 5 years old. And that's where the relationships really begin to mature, and we internally learn to receive love, for example. Above that, we have the higher frames, because these are all based on earthly elements. I talked about my element being in fire in my stomach and diaphragm right about here. But, the earth, the baseline is earth. The second is water. The third is fire, like I just said. And then the fourth is air. So breathing into our heart is kind of what naturally ends up happening more as we become adults. You'll notice that baby, for example, they breathe very heavily into their diaphragm, into their lower chakra centers, because their development requires that kind of oxygen, that kind of focus. But ultimately, as we become more and more adults, we become more breath, chest breathers rather than stomach breathers, if that makes sense. And it's only natural to do that, but in breath work and meditation, for example, it also allows us to kind of retrain our mind to notice if we're really experiencing things that subdue our creativity, that it's really important sometimes to find balance and recirculate air into those areas in order to allow that growth pattern to rise again. Ultimately, though, what I'm talking about in terms of manifestation is, as an adult, these upper chakras, they recycle. Now, I'm at 35 years old, so I'm at the maturation of my 5th 7-year cycle, or actually I'm moving into my 5th 7th year cycle, finishing out my 4th term. But ultimately, all that means is that I'm at a 4th level spiritual enlightened individual. So if you really look deeper into the 7-year developmental cycle, you can find a lot of fascinating realities to where you might be or how you might feel. And of course, this also climaxes at 7 versus 7, which is at 49, which in terms of our physical body also can represent and say, hey, you have actually lived a full life. And this is also, ironically enough or not, I don't really believe in coincidence, but a lot of internal sicknesses and new physiological developments tend to happen to individuals once they really climax at the spiritual and spiritual 49th paradigm. And I say spiritual and spiritual because every 7-year cycle ultimately starts at fear. Fear is the baseline. And then at the highest chakra or 7-year developmental cycle is spirituality. So we always start with fear. We move through these elements naturally as life. And then once you get to spiritual and spiritual, you end up kind of starting over. And basically where you were is like your birth chart, where you were born, when you were born, the stars and the constellations and the energy centers that surrounded you and you were brought into this life. Once you reach this 49th year pinnacle, entering into 50, you also get reborn, and there's also a balance and physiological incorporated tendency to not necessarily know what the next step is. It's like being a newborn again. So just, paying attention to these types of cycles in the planetary systems above us. And I don't remember which planet it was, but I believe it was Jupiter. It's the largest planet that takes that many years, 49 years or so, to recycle itself. And so that's ultimately why this could find some validity or validation. But furthermore, what I'm going to be talking about is manifestation and where and why I believe certain things have transpired due to what was occurring on my old channel. Now, I've been very tentative about actually approaching this subject because internally it came out of me in a sense because of what fearful elements kind of that reside inside of me. I never wanted to be public. I treated my old channel with my logo as the talking point or as the narrator of sorts. And in 2018, I had gone through a period of time where, like right now, the big topic in the world is social media, and this was my frame. This was a time in my life that I ultimately wanted to pursue knowledge of how certain things that I had noticed in the world were manifesting to me and why and where they were coming from. And as the 2018 finished, I had finished this project, which was ultimately putting this big business in line with their economical ties, if you will, to what it was. I ended up writing a book, not in a standard format, but in a similar fashion to what I was doing before. So this was called the Book of NAHX. And the Book of NAHX is basically volume number 1, if you will, and 10 chapters, essentially idealizing how I felt going through the process. And then also right at the pinnacle of when I saw this ultimately manifest, which was in January, end of January to start of February 2019 is when I wrote this book, or rather edited this book, because really what it is I would always just take clips from certain individuals, whether it be interviews or talks, and incorporate those also into and with movie clips and just the music. Because my opinion has been, and likely will continue to be also, that the creatives that put out the best movies, that put out the top chart music, that inspire or are put on the stage to ultimately, create this draw of purpose into our lives, they've gone through these experiences that we're ultimately kind of fighting to attain a lot of the times at the lower level. And I'm talking about the economic lower level, to achieve ultimate creativity and possibility in a lot of ways, whether we like to, or whether even I like to realize it or not. in a lot of situations, these people that we idolize, they've actually already gone through the transformation that I'm speaking of. They've kind of walked through fire and ended up on the other side with the possibility of really being the influencers of today. So, what I've realized through this process is that real or unreal didn't really matter, but I would see a lot of talking heads taking some of my talking points or focus energy into the real world. So whether or not a whole mass of people were actually watching, like this podcast, for example, those individuals that knew what I was talking about, they would take it onto their platforms and their audience and magnify it. Now, I liked this and I didn't like this throughout the process because, one, my ego says I want the attention. I want this. And in recent months, we've been talking a lot about like the social dilemma on Netflix show that really shows how polarizing that aspect is. I don't think that there's a necessity for humanity as a whole, as we are, to necessarily have to become so celebritized or idolized in the pursuit of just being awakened, being able to be creative. So what I kind of wanted to do was also go through and why I put out the show, or the Book of NAHX, as it were, the way that I did. So, in real quick, manifestation is when we take an idea, we put it on a paper, we either meditate on it or we journal on it, or we find ourselves in a place of expression, the creative capacity that surfaces. And then we put it out there, and then we recognize how that ripple effect, it's like, the whole, what is it? When you drop a metaphor of dropping a rock into the river or water, how those ripples kind of go out and ultimately they find a place at the water's edge. No matter how small or how big it is, they will carry that type of weight to the sides and ultimately encompass everything. So chapter 1 was titled Power of Words. So power of words is something that, learning to, in our throat chakra and what is called the lalata chakra, which is more like right here. I'm not as familiar with the lalata chakra. It kind of is an undertone within the 7th, but it's really important. Either way, we have another creative capacity within our throat. Within the 4 agreements, the very first agreement is basically be impeccable with your word, which to me, as I interpret that, is when I give my word to something, whether it's authentic to me or not, I want to be able to follow through with it. I shouldn't say it that way because I believe that a lot of the things I've been able to do have been very authentic, but ultimately I just always wanted to follow through with them. The idea of being impeccable by definition means without sin. So, there's a lot of different, philosophical ways of breaking down what sin is, whether it be by the way of Christianity and the 10 Commandments, or by way of Buddhism, which is a lot of internal observation and meditation and focus, and everything in between. I've been very well read throughout those, but not necessarily really recently. So I'm not going to go too much into depth for getting myself into a corner. But to me, as I interpreted be impeccable with your word, it was to say that if I was going to commit to something, I wanted to be able to follow through. So it also says that, like if I take a job and it requires me, like right now, to work from 8 a.m. to 8 p.m., unless there's an absolute reason for me to not be there or not follow through, whether that's by sickness, it's me having the authenticity and the firm belief that I am doing my best in that capacity. I'm not showing up late. I'm not leaving early. I'm not, not doing what I can to communicate with my bosses or whatnot in order to create this. Because when I take a day off, I don't communicate it. I do a no call, no show, for example. If that were to happen, that's where ultimately, even though I'm getting a day off of rest, I'm sitting more at home internally churning over the fact that, did I need this? Should I have done this? And am I really taking advantage of this day to the best of my ability? Where's my justification coming from? So the power of words ultimately comes to a realization that when I say something or commit to something, I follow through. Because if I do not, that ultimately it just affects me. It's just going to hurt me. It's never going to build me up. Now, I'm going to show you guys this chapter. It's fairly brief, and I don't believe it has any music in it that is going to cause this to not be able to be monetized in the long run. Not that I really care or worry about that. But the Book of NAHX was also narrated specifically and for good reason from many individuals who either died very early or were intertwined in the bigger paradigms of it. So this is inclusive of Tupac Shakur, who has a really interesting interview where he's talking about being between these two sides and not knowing what to do. There's Bruce Lee, who talks a lot about, he always had these interviews in line with the Hollywood, and he was in China and in the United States Hollywood, and had a lot of popularity within our culture in terms of this, but whether that was all authentic or not is kind of the breath of life that I always wanted and was curious about. And then Muhammad Ali. Muhammad Ali was an individual who decided and chose to not and stand up for his Muslim beliefs, or I don't remember what it was exactly because I didn't live in this time, but ultimately he defied what the popularity or political sphere would have otherwise wanted him to do because of who he was. So refusing to be a part of the draft and go to Vietnam in the 60s, 70s, it was a huge movement. And, all the things that he had to go through in order to. So he shares a poem that is very interesting. Again, words being used very powerfully is the whole reason for this initial chapter. So I want to share that with you now.
I believe strongly that my audience empathize with me because I show that side, I show that emotion. And so I think I can bring that more frontal, more directed into screenplays, more albums, producing, managing, you know what I'm saying? If I can figure out just how to control it, I can use it on a lot of different levels.
Well, I wrote a poem concerning the Africa prisoner killing the other day when this actually didn't happen, but it explains how the black brothers felt who died that day out there in that prison.
I trip off because it happens out of nothing. It just goes, everybody just be screaming and happy, and I just trip. I get uncomfortable, and it's like similar to a deer being caught in the headlights. I just freeze, and I don't know what to do.
You don't surrender. If you don't come out now, we will kill all of you. Got 5 minutes. Then what's your reply? And a black man came out and he said, better far from all we see, to die fighting to be free. What more fitting end could be? Better surely than in bed, where in broken health we're led, lingering until we're dead. Better than with prayers and pleas, or in the clutch of some disease, wasting slowly by degrees. Better that of heart attack or some dose of drug we lack.
I don't know if I should be what they want me to be, or if I should make them hate me so they can stop. Like say something mean so they can just stop. But I'm just like caught in the middle of it because you can't. No one can do that.
Let us die by being black. Better far that we should go, standing here against the foe. Is there sweeter death to know? Better than the bloody stain on some highway where we are laying. torn by flying glass and pain. Better calling death to come than to die another dumb, muted black man in the slum. Better than of this prison rot. If there's any choice we've got, kill us today on the spot. Better far our fight to wage now while our blood boils with rage, lest it cool with ancient age. Better violent for us to die than to give up and Uncle Tom and try, making peace just to live a lie. Better if we say our sooth, we gonna die today demanding truth while we're still akin to youth. Better now than later on, now that fear of death is gone, never mind another dawn.
So me with just words, it's like a battle to find the right words to say at the right time.
To me, at least the way that when I teach it, all type of knowledge ultimately means self-knowledge. Mm-hmm. So therefore, they're coming in to, and ask me to teach them not so much of how to defend themselves or how to do somebody in. Rather, they want to learn to express themselves through some movement, be it anger, be it determination, or whatsoever.
So that's chapter 1. I'm not going to go too far behind that right now, but as I hope that you would be able to see in there, there's a lot of power, and I'm just kind of like dissecting it and cutting it to the music so that it's more presentable. There's some subtleties in it that I incorporated as well in terms of the audio, which was that train whistle that's going on in the background, the horn. And, to me, that's the indication like, hey, the train's going again. This is me. I'm going to go out here and say something that is an honest expression. And so chapter 1 here, as presented, incorporates these individuals, Tupac Shakur, Bruce Lee, and Muhammad Ali specifically, to get the train rolling. And again, as I put this out there, it was actually originally also, there's a second part to it, which is a scene from To Kill a Mockingbird, in which Atticus is up on as the lawyer defending and presenting his case to, eradicate or basically say, hey, this black versus white paradigm it's unimportant. Really, if we really look at the words of the Constitution as they were written, that all men will be treated equally. And the fact that or not Boo, but the black man, and I don't remember all the characterizations here, I apologize for that shortcoming there, but he's sitting there on stage being attacked and put there for the fact that he had kissed a white woman. And so I also incorporated that as the power of words and the manipulation that was kind of taking place, because at that time I had also seen how kind of the larger facets of media and indulgences with film and music were literally being taken out of my own mouth and then presented and given all the freaking economic growth to those that were already above me. And that's where the envy that I maybe had going into these types of projects or before really understanding it felt different, to where afterward I saw and felt as though I was being taken advantage of. And so there are 10 chapters in this, and I'll probably likely be uploading that in its full form at certain point in time here very shortly, so that it can at least have breath again. I had ultimately chosen to actually completely take this off of my old channel at a certain point. But as it plays out, and just so that I can give some context behind it, Chapter 2 moves into a presentation of Fight Club with a couple other narratives and films involving fight, like Rocky, but fight or flight. So this is that internal thing where you either run away or you run toward what you're pursuing. So there's a fear element, and I believe it's actually presented very poignantly. Even me today, sometimes when I go back and watch this chapter 2, internally I can feel it. Also, Chuck Norris comes in, and like it culminates where Bruce Lee is fighting Chuck Norris in the Coliseum at the end, and there's some very polarizing um, expressions that happen within this in terms of that conversation with Chuck Norris talking about his fight with Bruce Lee at the Coliseum. And then chapter 3 is a lyrical movement. A lyrical movement goes more into how music, it really speaks very poignantly, and not, for me, this was a very very personal one. Ironically, it comes from an individual named Eminem or Slim Shady or Marshall Mathers. So it's called The Ringer, and the Ringer song at the end, it's very straight to the point. And I remember a specific time where during my time building the original project, was approached from and directly corresponding with an individual identifying themselves as Agent Orange. And in that song, although I did eliminate a couple stanzas at the very end of the song just for a little bit of breath that I wanted to incorporate into it, the lyrical movement showed how a lot of these expressions that make it to mainstream media or mainstream music end up out there, but also from a very awakened state of mind. Chapter 4 is Advantage of Adversary, in which I bring on and do what I had usually done, which was an Adidas advantage of adversary with Adidas. And this is where Ice Cube on the 4th chapter kind of has an opportunity, but I'm also bringing in more of the spectrum of what mainstream rap and those individuals behind the scenes actually are, and who they are and how they are in a positive light as well as possibly in a negative light. And then chapter 5, which is kind of the halfway point of this, where it's basically expresses managing the matrix. And after that, the second part of this first volume of Book of NaHX kind of culminates there, where we're going through our second breath of the matrix, and the matrix being a place where it's really difficult to fully engage and understand what the matrix is or how it can be interpreted, especially since 1999 when the original film came out. But I hope this gives you a little bit of a realization why I'm kind of maybe doing things the way that I am, and why I'm choosing to express this in the way I am. So thank you all for listening. I hope you enjoy the new studio and where I'm at, but we do appreciate all that you have done for us or me, and thank you very much. Till next time. Peace.